My name's Chandra and I'm doing my presentation over trigger warnings on campus, and more specifically trigger warnings at Texas Tech University. And so what I'd like to do in this presentation is just go over what trigger warnings are and really why is it relevant to Texas Tech University, why is it a complex problem, and how is it associated with Texas Tech University. A lot of times people can, make presentations and write papers and stuff like that, but really it doesn't apply to the university or to solving a complex problem within the university. And so today I'd just like to go over what trigger warnings are. I want to walk through the specific disciplines that I studied and the research that I did that are the most relevant disciplines that will help solve this complex problem. So first off, I want to just go a little bit over my abstract just of what trigger warnings are and what I'm really going to be focusing on. So trigger warnings are basically intended to alert the participant if the content that's provided in the class is going to provoke a strong emotional response from the participant. And then, for the university's sake, the participant is going to be the student. And so if there's going to be material presented in the class or discussed, whether that is something that's in an actual conversation that the student is having with the professor or hearing from the professor in a lecture, a video that's going to be presented in class, or any just strong content that will be presented in the class, a trigger warning would basically be put on a course syllabi saying, hey, there's going to be specific information in this class that's going to be covered, and it's just a general warning for the student, and that way it gives them the opportunity to opt out of that class, the specific class, or maybe just not take the class as a whole because they have a deeper understanding of what material is going to be covered. So in this paper, I talked about how trigger warnings can basically apply to anyone because anyone has gone through a traumatic event. And so in the research that I went through, people who went through traumatic events in their life, who have been exposed to trauma, typically those are the people who are really needing a trigger warning because they, if someone is going through post-traumatic stress disorder, or they've been sexually abused or assaulted or something like that, then they're not going to want to be participating in a class where that content or something in that form is going to be brought up in that class, because it's going to provoke just a strong emotional response from that person. It's going to make them feel really uncomfortable and maybe have to walk through and relive through those moments and times. And so but the reason why I wanted to do this research and relate it back to Texas Tech University is because at Texas Tech we have a program for recovering addicts. And so it's one of my minors is addiction and recovery, and so this is just an area where I kind of understand what people are going through, and I've had the opportunity to study it more. But what I actually learned while doing my research for this paper is that actually a lot of the professors and students are recovering addicts. And so I think that trigger warnings, based on my research and what I found, should be an option for students, taking courses at Texas Tech University, because an addict is in that area. An addict is someone someone who is in recovery should be exposed or have a warning presented to them saying, hey, there's going to be strong content in this class, and that might be something that for that addict might provoke a relapse. And so in my research that I've done, trauma is specifically associated with trigger warnings. That's people who have been through traumatic events want trigger warnings, presented to them in their courses. But what I actually found is that addiction and recovery is actually a traumatic event in itself. And so if addiction and recovery is a traumatic event, then we would need specifically trigger warnings to be presented on campus for specific people who are in the process of recovery, because we wouldn't want them to relapse and go through this other traumatic event. And so and that kind of leads into my next discussion are the specific subjects that I studied in doing research for this paper. And one of them was addiction and recovery, but before I got to how that's most relevant to this subject and also most relevant to Texas Tech University, is I wanted to study what trigger warnings are. And, a lot of my research, like I've been saying, has correlated trauma with trigger warnings, but I had to really understand what is trauma, what does that mean. And so the first discipline that I found that was most relevant to this situation is psychology. And psychology is so broad. There's so many different like subjects and factors and doctors and everything that's just related to psychology as a whole. But psychological trauma is the main thing that I just really honed in on, just because I wanted to understand the psychological aspect of what is trauma, and how is that related to trigger warnings. And that's, like I've been saying, that's how I found out that someone who specifically has been through a traumatic event, that's why they would need a trigger warning, just to prevent them from having, any just negative feeling or negative, just bringing something up that they don't want to deal with or that they have dealt with in the past or something like that. And so Texas Tech University strives themselves on, promoting student success and being there for the students and making sure that they're comfortable and they're enjoying their classes. And so trigger warnings would help a student in their mental success, just because if, let's say, a student had gone through something in the past, and we're just talking from a psychological standpoint, not even on the addiction side, but if someone had gone through something and then they wanted to take a class and then something was presented in the class where it made them feel really uncomfortable and they just didn't want to even participate in the class, the trigger warnings as a whole would kind of be their protection from specific things that are discussed in the class. And maybe even, discussing with the professor beforehand, I know that this material will be discussed in class, therefore I'm actually not going to be able to participate in this, and maybe issuing a specific assignment or a different assignment from the professor that will make up for the time that they had missed for the specific things that they weren't a part of. And so so in the first discipline that I studied, that mainly made me figure out why trauma is associated with trigger warnings. And then from there, I went into addiction recovery because, like I said, at Texas Tech University, we promote student success, but then also we have this program for students and professors who are recovering addicts, the process of addiction and recovery, and just studying those things. And what I found was that addiction and recovery, or addiction, is actually a traumatic event in itself. And it's not just someone who went through an addiction. It's anyone who is related to the addict or the actions that they participated in, because an addict makes specific decisions on their own that affect other people. What I also found out is that trauma it doesn't have to affect that specific person, just like addiction doesn't have to just affect that specific person. It affects people who are around it. So someone who was just associated with the event. So if I saw someone being murdered, then I would have experienced trauma. Even though it didn't physically happen to me, I was still a part of it because I witnessed it. And so for me, that can be a specific traumatic event. And then therefore, if we were talking about something along the lines of that in a class, I would want a trigger warning for that, because I would never want to have to relive through the things that I had seen. So all in all, in my research, what I found is that trigger warnings they're a good thing. There's so many debates in my research that I found that mainly from professors who have just said, this isn't good, we're coddling the American mind. That was one of the articles that I had read. And we're protecting these people, but really there's a big need, because people, especially in today's time, they're going through a lot and they're experiencing really traumatic events. They're actually physically experiencing it, but then you can also just witness a traumatic event and not have actually gone through the traumatic event, but still experience trauma. And so in order to promote student success, and from the physical aspect, but then also mentally, Texas Tech University wants to promote student success. It's important that we provide trigger warnings to these students, especially students who have gone through addiction and recovery, because we would never want someone to relapse in a class just because of the material that was covered in the class. So my name is Chandra Morgan, and thank you for listening.